Hello and welcome to another video in the How to Make a Chrome Extension video tutorial series. In this video, we're going to talk about how to hide and show the stopped and running status tags, how to enable and disable the buttons to either run or stop the app depending on which button is clicked. We'll also talk about how to show an error message right underneath the inputs if any of them are invalid. Let's get started. The first thing we need to do is go up to the tags at the top of the page and add a unique ID for the running and stop tags. So I'll call the running tag a running span and the stop tag stop span. In our background.js file, let's add the listeners for the elements, starting with the running span, then the stop span. So we have the span variables set. Let's go back to the Chrome extension window and hit right-click inspect, and I'll show you how to take a look at how to hide and disable these visually. If you click the top left arrow here, and then you hover over the running span, it'll automatically select it for you. Inside of element.style, we can work with something called a display. Display gives us a bunch of options, block, contents, flex, and all of these different options here. The one we're interested in is a display of none. When we enable a display of none, it means that the span will hide. And if we remove none from the display value, it comes back. So we can use this trick to hide and show our spans whenever the app is either running or stopped. For the buttons, we can do something slightly different. We can use a disabled attribute to enable or disable the buttons. So right-click inspect on the button here, and towards the end of the opening tag, we'll go double-click and write disabled. After you hit enter, you'll notice that you can no longer click this, and the stop button is still enabled. If you remove the disabled attribute, the button is usable again. So we'll use the disabled attribute to enable and disable our buttons, and we'll use the display style attribute to show or hide our running spans. Back in our code in popup.js, I'm going to create a helper method called hideElement. It's going to take an element parameter, and on this element parameter, we're going to set the style of display to none. I'll make another helper right beneath it called showElement. It takes the same element parameter, and we set the style display attribute to just an empty string, exactly like we did in the Chrome Dev Tools. Let's make another element for enabling and disabling the buttons. I'll start off with the disable element method, and on here we will directly set the disabled attribute to true. Let's do the same thing for the enable element method, except this time disabled will be false. Let's use these methods down in where we populate our inputs with the data that we've saved locally. I'm going to remove this console log, and let's write if is running. We want to show the running span and hide the stop span. And the opposite for if it's not running, where we show the stop span and hide the running span. Let's give it a try. Back in our Chrome extension window, we see a stopped here. That's because it's either false or it's undefined, meaning we never saved a running status. So if we never saved a running status, then we know that there is no alarm. Therefore, it's reasonable to assume that the app is not running. If we hit the save and start button, jump out of the window and come back in, you'll see that the running span is now visible. If we hit stop and jump out of the window and come back in, the stop span is now available. So it's working, but we need to make sure that we update it whenever the buttons are also clicked. Back in the pop-up JavaScript file, I'm going to make another method. Below enable element, I'll call this handle on start state. I'm going to cut these two lines here, and I will write handle on start state, and I'll paste those two lines in handle on start state. I'll make another method called handle on stop state. I'll cut these two methods here, and I'll write handle on stop state, and I'll paste those two lines into the method itself. The reason we're making these methods is because we want both of these to run when the data is populated, when the pop-up extension window is open, but also whenever the buttons are clicked. So we're duplicating a set of events, and we don't want to duplicate our code in two places. We want to centralize to one place. Inside of start button, I'm going to call handle on start state, and inside of stop button, click event listener, I'm going to call handle on stop state. Back in our Chrome extension window, if we hit save and start, it's immediately running, and if we hit stop, we see the span immediately change. Now let's focus on disabling and enabling the buttons. We can continue to use our methods here because we know that we're handling the start state or the stop state. I'm going to add a comment here of spans, and then below the spans, I'll write buttons. Whenever the user hits the save and start button, we want to disable the save and start button and enable the stop button. Whenever the user hits the stop button, we want to disable the stop button and enable the save and start button. If the user hits the start button, we want to disable the start button and we want to enable the stop button. And I'll rewrite the comments down here. Let's do almost the same thing here. Instead of disabling the start button, whenever the user hits the stop button, we're going to disable the stop button and enable the start button. We'll write disable element of stop button and enable element of start button. Whenever we open our Chrome extension window, you'll notice that the stop button is already disabled with the save and start button enabled, and our stop tag is visible with our running tag hidden. If we hit save and start, the running tag is visible, the save and start button is disabled, and the stop button enabled. Let's click out of it, jump back in, and the same state has saved. The button disabling and the stop tags are working properly. Now let's add some error messaging in the pop-up window. If the user selects an invalid start or end date, or if for some reason the location ID is invalid, we want to show an error message whenever they hit the save and start button. And we don't want the save and start button to proceed with the on-click event listener. We want it to stop before the message is ever sent to the background script so the alarm can start running. In our case, we want to stop it before then, so that we can show the error and the user can correct their invalid inputs. An easy way to do this is by adding a piece of text underneath the elements that we care about, like a location ID, start and end date, with an ID of location ID error, and then we can specify the error message inside of here. Hop back to our Chrome extension window, and we will immediately see it. It's appearing in the right location, but we have to give it a little bit of styling. And we also want to hide it whenever the user opens the window. And we only want to explicitly show it whenever the user hits the save and start button. So first thing, let's give it a style of help with is-danger. And all this does is it gives it a red text and decreases the font size. Now let's set the display to a value of none. Similar to what we did with our running and stop spans, we are going to set the initial display of this text to none, meaning it's not going to be visible. Now, if we open the Chrome extension window, you won't see it anymore. The text code is still there, but the display type is none, meaning it's not visible to the user. Let's do the same thing for the start and end dates. We'll write another paragraph, this time with an ID of start date error. We'll use the same class and we'll give it a style of display none. And for the error message, we'll write please enter a valid start date. I'll copy this and use the same field for the end date, except I will change start to end date error, and I'll write please enter a valid end date. Let's hop to our pop-up JavaScript file and let's create error message listeners for the 3 error messages that we created. We'll start with the location ID with location ID error, then we do the start date error, and finally the end date error. We've got the variables set up. Let's start using them. Before we hit either the handle on start state or the prefs in the start button, we want to make sure that we validate the inputs before we ever reach the on start state and before we ever send the message to the background script to start the background job. Let's do that by making another method to handle all of our validations before we ever enter into this block. So right above the start button on click event listener, I'm going to create another method called perform on start validations. Inside of here, we can validate all of the inputs and also show the errors if any of the inputs are invalid. Let's start with the location ID. So if location ID element .value does not exist, or if it's empty or something's wrong with that input, we're going to show the element of location ID error. And if it's valid, we're going to hide that element of location ID error. Let's do the same thing for the start and end dates. So if the start date element .value is empty or undefined or null, we're going to show the start date error text. But if it's valid, we're going to hide that error text. Same thing for the end date. And finally, what we want to do is return the values. If any of these are invalid inputs, we don't want it to proceed with sending the prefs to the background message or with any of the hiding or enabling of the buttons or the statuses. We just want to show the errors and leave the user on the pop-up extension window. So inside of the start button on click event handler, I'm going to write all fields valid, and we're going to set that to perform on start validations. And if all fields are valid, then we'll run this block. To recap, whenever the user hits the start button, we're going to validate all of the inputs. So we check to make sure that every input has a value, isn't empty, or is not null. If any of the fields are invalid, then we're going to show the error field for the user to fix that error. And we're going to stop the user from ever entering this flow. Now, the way we do that is by returning the values themselves. So we return location ID element.value and the start date element.value and the end date element.value. This will return a Boolean. If all of these are true, then it returns true. If even one of them are false, then it returns false. If any one of these are false, then the user is never going to be able to enter this block of code. Let's give it a try. Back in our application window, if I hit save and start, I'm going to see 2 error messages pop up, one for the start date and one for the end date. If I enter a valid date for the start date here and I hit save and start, I only see 1 error message for the end date. And so if I fix that and hit save and start, it proceeds into the running state. If I hit stop, it proceeds into the stop state. If I remove the date that I've entered here and hit save and start, the error message shows up again. Great, so we have basic validation happening on the start date and end dates and location IDs. We're showing error messages whenever any of those inputs are invalid. One thing you may want to think about, and maybe you can do this as a homework assignment, or I may show you how to do this in a future video. You may want to look at if the start date is after today and not something in the past, and if the end date is not before the start date. So you may want to check the end and start dates to confirm that those are valid dates that aren't in the past, or if the end date is before the start date. One last thing that we want to do here is disable all of these inputs whenever the app is running. So if they hit save and start, we disable all of these inputs, and if the user hits stop, then we enable these inputs again. We can do that by disabling the elements in onStartState. Right, disable element. We'll do it for the location ID element, for the start date element, and finally the end date element. Let's do the same thing for the onStopState, where we enable all of the inputs. We have the elements all enabled whenever the user hits stop and disabled whenever the user hits start. Back in our app, if we hit save and start, we can't change any of the inputs or the save and start button. And if we hit stop, we can change any of the inputs. In the next video, we're going to run an API job every minute. And we're also going to discuss how to show notifications whenever one appointment has been found, and how to redirect the user to a web page whenever that notification is clicked. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe so I can continue to make more of these videos. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Jerry Hacks.